He called her just a secretary in front of the board. Then found out she owned the company. Rain streaked down the floor to ceiling windows of the 62nd floor, blurring the lights of Manhattan into long gold ribbons. Inside, the boardroom of Halstead & Cross was warm, too warm, filled with the smell of expensive coffee and the low hum of nervous small talk. 12 executives sat around a table of polished walnut, waiting for a meeting that would decide the future of the company. At the head of the table stood Daniel Reyes, 38 years old, sharp-jawed, dressed in a navy suit that fit like it had been tailored for a magazine cover, because it had been. Daniel was the newly appointed chief operating officer of Halstead & Cross, a mid-size investment firm that had just landed the biggest deal of its decade, a merger with Ashcroft Capital, one of the most respected private equity firms on the East Coast. Daniel had worked for this moment his entire career. Harvard MBA, 6 years climbing the ladder at 2 different banks, a reputation for being ruthless, precise, and just charming enough to get away with it. Today, he was going to close the deal that would make him a legend inside these walls. What he didn't know was that the woman he was about to humiliate in front of the entire board was the reason the deal existed at all. Her name was Elena Voss, 34 years old. Quiet in the way that made people underestimate her, not shy, just economical with her words, as if she'd learned a long time ago that most rooms didn't deserve her full attention. She wore a simple black wrap dress, no jewelry except a thin silver watch, and she'd walked into the Halstead & Cross building 40 minutes early that morning, badge in hand, and taken a seat in the back corner of the boardroom without a word to anyone. Nobody recognized her. That was exactly how she wanted it. 3 years earlier, Elena had built a small holding company from a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, using a modest inheritance and a stubborn refusal to quit. She called it Soulful Holdings. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't have a flashy office or a PR team. But Elena had a gift. She could see value in companies before anyone else did. The way some people can hear a melody in silence. She bought struggling firms quietly, restructured them without drama, and sold them for triple the price. 2 years later, by the time she was 32, Soulful Holdings had a controlling stake in 4 companies. By 33, it had 11. 6 months ago, Soulful had quietly acquired 61% of Ashcroft Capital, the very firm Daniel Reyes believed he was about to merge with as an equal partner. Elena hadn't announced it. She didn't do press releases. She let the world assume Ashcroft was still run by its old founders, while she sat behind the scenes, watching, learning, deciding who deserved a seat at her table. Today, she'd come to watch the man who was about to try to buy her company without knowing he already worked for her. "Let's begin," Daniel said, clapping his hands together once, the sound sharp against the glass walls. "I want to thank everyone for being here on such short notice. As most of you know, the Ashcroft deal represents the single largest transaction in this firm's history." He clicked through his slides: projected revenue, synergy targets, a 5-year growth model that painted a future so rosy it looked hand-painted. The board members nodded along, some scribbling notes, most simply nodding because nodding was safer than asking question. Elena sat quietly, arms folded, watching Daniel's confidence build with every slide. He was good. She'd give him that. He knew how to hold a room, but he hadn't once looked toward the back corner. Hadn't once wondered who the woman in black was, or why she'd been allowed into a meeting this sensitive. It was the intern, a nervous 23-year-old named Priya, who made the first mistake. Mr. Reyes," Priya said, glancing nervously between Daniel and Elena. "Should I bring in another chair?" "I wasn't sure if..." "She's fine where she is," Daniel said without even glancing over, waving a hand dismissively. "That's just admin support. Probably here to take notes for legal." He turned back to his slides. "Now, moving on to valuation." A few people chuckled softly. Elena said nothing. She simply opened the leather folder in front of her and began writing. Unbothered, the same way she'd been unbothered by every man who had ever underestimated her in the last decade. Daniel kept going, riding the momentum of the room, feeding off the nods and the murmurs of approval. Then came the moment that would end his career at Halstead & Cross before lunch. "Look," he said, leaning forward, hands braced on the table, addressing the senior partners directly. I know some of you have concerns about integrating Ashcroft's leadership, but let's be honest, that company has been coasting on its founder's old reputation for years. Weak governance, no real vision. Whoever's quietly running the show over there clearly doesn't understand modern finance. He smirked, the kind of smirk that came from a man who had never once been told no. Frankly, I could run that place better with my eyes closed. The room went still for half a second. Then, almost as a joke, one of the senior partners, a heavy-set man named Frank Whitmore, glanced toward the back of the room and said, "You want to weigh in on that, ma'am? You're from Ashcroft's side, aren't you?" Daniel finally turned. He looked at Elena. Really looked at her for the first time. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by that same dismissive ease. "With respect," he said, smiling thinly, "I think this conversation is a little above the pay grade of admin staff. No offense." Elena closed her folder, set down her pen, and for the first time that morning she spoke. "None taken," she said, her voice calm. Unhurried, the kind of calm that made people lean in instead of relax. "But I think there has been a small misunderstanding. I'm not admin staff, Mr. Reyes. My name is Elena Voss. I'm the majority shareholder and acting chairwoman of Ashcroft Capital." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight, that pressed against the glass walls of the boardroom like the storm outside. "I also happen to own a controlling interest in Solvent Holdings," she continued, standing now, smoothing the front of her dress, "which, as of 11 o'clock this morning, holds 43% of Halstead and crosses outstanding shares purchased quietly over the last 4 months through 3 separate investment vehicles." She let that settle. "So to clarify, Mr. Reyes, you weren't proposing a merger between equals. You were pitching an acquisition to the woman who already owns most of the company you work for." Daniel's face went through 3 colors in the span of 5 seconds. Pale, then red, then a strange grayish-white that made him look 10 years older. That's not possible," he stammered. The filings are with legal counsel as of this morning," Elena said. "You'll receive formal notice by end of day. I wanted to see this meeting happen first. I wanted to see how you'd run a room when you thought no one important was watching." She looked around the table, at the executives who had laughed along with Daniel just minutes earlier, now sitting frozen, unsure whether to apologize or disappear. "Now I know." Frank Whitmore, to his credit, was the first to recover. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and extended a hand across the table. "Miss Voss, it's an honor. I had no idea. I apologize for—" "You don't need to apologize, Frank," Elena said, shaking his hand. "You didn't say anything you should be ashamed of. You asked a fair question." Her eyes moved briefly, deliberately, to Daniel. "Not everyone in this room can say the same." Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Miss Howard Voss, if I had known who you were, I never would have." "That's exactly the problem," Elena said, cutting him off, not with anger, but with the flat precision of someone stating a fact. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect. You looked at a woman sitting quietly in the corner of a room and decided she wasn't worth your attention. Not because of anything I did, because of what you assumed I was." She paused. "That tells me more about how you'll run a company than any slide deck you just showed me." The room was so quiet now that the rain against the windows sounded like static. "I've been in rooms like this my whole career," Elena continued, walking slowly along the length of the table, her heels the only sound besides the storm outside. "I've been mistaken for a secretary, an assistant, someone's daughter tagging along, someone's wife waiting to be picked up. I used to correct people. Now I just watch. Because the way someone treats a person they think has no power tells you everything about the person they'll become the moment they get power of their own." She stopped near the head of the table, near Daniel, who suddenly looked much smaller than he had 20 minutes earlier. "You're talented, Reyes. Your projections were sharp. Your delivery was confident. In another version of this meeting, I might have offered you a bigger role in the new structure." She let the words hang there deliberately before delivering the final line. But confidence without character isn't leadership. It's just performance. And I don't invest in performances. By the following Monday, the story had already started moving through the firm like wildfire. The kind of story employees whisper about in elevators and repeat at happy hour for years afterward. Daniel Reyes was quietly removed from the Ashcroft deal. Not fired outright. Elena wasn't interested in public humiliation, only in truth, but reassigned to a much smaller division, stripped of the authority he'd spent 6 years building. Priya, the intern who had nervously tried to offer Elena a chair, found an email in her inbox 2 weeks later. It was short, direct, signed simply, E. Voss. It offered her a paid analyst position at Solvane Holdings, along with a single line that she would keep pinned above her desk for the rest of her career. You were the only person in that room who saw me as a person before you knew what I owned. That instinct is worth more than any degree. Come work for people who already know how to treat others. I'll teach you the rest. Elena didn't attend many meetings after that. She didn't need to. Her presence had already rearranged the entire culture of the firm without a single press release, without a single public statement, without raising her voice once. People started holding doors a little longer. Junior staff got asked their opinions in meetings instead of being talked over. New hires were told, quietly, during orientation. Nobody here is just anything. You never know who's sitting in the corner of the room. Daniel Reyes eventually left the firm 8 months later, taking a role at a smaller company across town. Word was he'd changed, genuinely changed. Not the performative kind of humility people fake after getting caught, but the real kind that comes from having your whole self-image dismantled in front of colleagues and having to rebuild it from the ground up. He sent Elena a short note before he left. She never responded, but she kept it in a drawer in her office. Not out of spite, but as a reminder of the version of leadership she refused to become. Elena Voss never gave interviews about that day. There was no LinkedIn post, no viral video, no carefully worded statement about leading with humility. She simply went back to work, buying undervalued companies no one else believed in, quietly restructuring them, quietly changing the lives of the people inside them. But every person who was in that boardroom on that rainy Tuesday carried the same lesson home with them. Whether they wanted to or not, power rarely announces itself. It sits quietly in the corner of the room, taking notes, waiting to see who you really are when you think no one important is watching. And in a city like New York, where every glass tower is full of people, convinced they can spot power from across a boardroom table, that is, perhaps, the most dangerous assumption of all. The end.